Good morning, and welcome to another Dhamma talk. Good morning so far to Gita Jnana, Adine, Jens, Michael, Kyle, Kauser Friend, and Mike. Good to see all of you joining in. Also happy that people who already are familiar with Dhamma are joining for an introductory talk. So one of the lovely things about getting back to the basics is that you often find that strengthening your foundation helps you to better understand the more advanced aspects of Dhamma. So it's never a waste of time to listen to an introductory talk because you never know what you might pick up or what might be reinforced. Hello also to Alexandra. And Vimlanyani Bhikkhuni, good morning, Aya. Good to see you. Yeah. We'll start by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So here at the monastery, this is the first day of a 5-day retreat. So we're starting a period of more intensive meditation practice. And so we're taking the opportunity to get back to the basics and refresh our perspective on what meditation practice is and how it fits into the path to enlightenment, what its relevance is to the path of awakening. And again, refreshing the mind of some basic strategies and tactics for meditation, ways to approach it in a way that's wholesome. And one thing that I find useful is coming back to the Pali terms. So returning as much as possible to the actual intent of the Buddha. So the connotations of the words that he used often help to clarify what he was trying to communicate. And it's interesting to note that there's no Pali word which exactly matches the English word meditation. And the word in Pali which most often gets connected to the English word meditation is bhavana. But bhavana does not mean meditating. Bhavana literally means bringing into being, causing to exist, bringing into being. So the word bhavana means bringing wholesome mind states into being. So when the Buddha was talking about meditation, this is what he was talking about. He was talking about bringing wholesome mind states into being, causing wholesome mind states to exist. And I find this incredibly helpful because it actually gives a very clear sense of what it is that we're doing in meditation practice. It helps to clarify what we're trying to achieve, and also the methodologies that we're using. So if we're doing something and unwholesome mind states are coming into being, then we're not practicing bhavana. We're doing something else, and it's either not helpful or counterproductive. But if what we're doing is bringing wholesome mind states into being, then we're practicing bhavana. Even if it's not necessarily a meditation technique that you learned on a retreat or read in a book, if it's bringing wholesome mind states into being, then it's bhavana. It's the cultivation of wholesome mind states that the Buddha recommended. Nonetheless, we do have a number of meditation techniques that we use, and many of these come from the suttas, the Pali suttas, and some have been developed in later centuries based upon the words of the Buddha, based upon the teachings of the Buddha. And these techniques have stood the test of time because they are universally applicable. They're relevant to everyone in every kind of body, every kind of mind. There are a number of basic approaches which are relevant to pretty much everyone, depending upon the particular conditions and challenges that they're facing. So one thing that I find really useful is, first off, to get a sense of what it is, what our final goal is. So if you don't know where you're going, then it's very difficult to figure out the right direction to move in. So remembering that ultimately Buddhist practice is about attaining enlightenment. It's about attaining awakening. So what is that? Well, the Buddha gave a very simple definition. He said it is the permanent elimination of greed, hatred, and delusion. The permanent destruction of desire, aversion, and confusion. It is the perfection of insight, of wisdom, of a direct knowing of things as they really are. Yatabhutang jnana dasanam. So knowing and seeing reality as it is. And it's the attainment of unconditional happiness. So the Buddha said, Nibbanang paramang sukhang. Enlightenment is the paramount happiness. Enlightenment is the supreme happiness. So this is what we're aiming at. The purification of the mind by eliminating all desire, aversion, and underlying tendencies towards liking and disliking. The elimination of all confusion and delusion, and the development of wise, insightful knowing and seeing of reality as it actually is. Which carries with it the implication that whatever our current experience is, it's not knowing and seeing things as they actually are. We're living in a dream world. We're living in a distorted, hazy shadow of reality, which we take as real. So we're trying to wake up from this distorted misperception of reality. We're trying to wake up from this crazy dream that we've been in for longer than we can remember, which is another word that the Buddha used to describe the final goal. He described the goal of Buddhist practice as Bodhi. So Bodhi, besides being the name of a tree, Bodhi literally means awakening, waking up. And Buddha means the awakened one, the one who is awake. So that's also what we're trying to do, which again, if the goal of Buddhist practice is to be awake, that implies that we're currently asleep. We're currently not awake. Again, we're currently living in a dream world of our own imagining, something which is not quite real. It's here, but it's not quite real. So we're also trying to see through how we generate our own distorted dream world. That's another thing that we're trying to do in Buddhist practice. But all of that depends upon the cultivation of clear self-awareness and starting to stabilize the mind, steady the mind. So through stabilizing the mind, steadying the mind, we become more capable of seeing things as they are. We become more capable of seeing our own mind as it is. A metaphor that I like to use is like when you're taking a picture. If you're constantly shaking the camera back and forth, then the picture is going to be blurry and unclear. But if you hold the camera very steady and still, then you can take a sharp, clear picture. It's the same with our mind. Our mind is in a constant state of agitation and disturbance, which is why it's difficult for us to see things clearly. So one element of meditation practice is training the mind to be stable, learning how to make the mind steady and still, so that I can see things sharply and clearly. So that's what we call Samadhi practice, which is often translated as concentration. So Samadhi practice is stilling and stabilizing the mind, which then makes it possible to see things clearly. So that's one thing that we're doing. And that cultivation of Samadhi, the stilling and stabilizing of the mind, also helps a little bit with the reduction of defilements. Because in order to still and stabilize the mind, it's necessary to clear away the coarser, stronger, more obvious defilements. It's necessary to clear away the more blatant desires and aversions from the mind. Because if the mind is constantly chasing after what it wants and hating what it doesn't want, then it will never be stable. It will always be in a state of disturbance. Similarly, the development of Samadhi requires the cultivation of some amount of mental clarity. So it's necessary to have mindfulness and awareness in order to cultivate Samadhi. Otherwise, the mind will always be drifting in a haze. And when the mind is drifting and hazy, then once again, it's not steady and it's not clear. So the cultivation of Samadhi already helps to reduce our greed, hatred, and delusion somewhat. Some people say that Samadhi is just a preliminary to insight practice. They say that Samadhi is just a preliminary to doing the real practice. But this is not correct. This is not the correct way to understand things. Samadhi is already the real practice. Samadhi practice is already starting to clear away greed, hatred, and delusion. Therefore, it's part of a continuum of development, which starts with unenlightenment and concludes in enlightenment. So don't look down on Samadhi practice. It's a very important element of training the mind in wholesome qualities. And it's also possible to do meditation practices which are specifically about cultivating other wholesome mind states. So Samadhi is one example of a wholesome mind state that we can develop. Another very common example is loving kindness. So a mind of infinite, all-embracing benevolence. This is a very commonly practiced meditation technique, especially in Theravada Buddhism. In fact, many people who grew up in Buddhist countries, especially in Sri Lanka, I found that even people who don't really know much about the Buddhist teachings and don't really know anything about insight meditation or don't really know much about jhana or concentration practices, often they know about loving kindness and they practice some form of loving kindness meditation very frequently. So this is one of the most well-known, venerated meditation methods in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, is this practice of cultivating a kind, gentle, benevolent heart, a mind of goodwill towards all beings. So once again, this is a form of bhavana, in that it's bringing into being a wholesome state of mind. And the cultivation of loving kindness works as a direct counter to aversion. It also helps to reduce greed to some degree, because when you're focused just on wishing for everyone to be happy, then you're not so focused on your own desires. You're not so fixated on your own greed. And it also helps to stabilize the mind. So loving kindness practice also helps to stabilize the mind, which then makes Samadhi easier to attain. It makes Samadhi easier to develop, which again is a direct supporting factor to the cultivation of wisdom. And there are also practices which are more specifically about breaking through the false perceptions that we have of the world. So there's three primary false perceptions that we tend to have. So there's the false perception of conditional happiness, the false perception of permanence, and the false perception of self-identity. So normally we relate to the world in this way. We relate to the world of, I am this persistent being who wants to get those things that will make me happy. That's how we normally go through our lives. So we think, I am this person who is not particularly happy, and if I get that cake, then I will be happy. This is how we normally tend to think. This is utter delusion, and it's what keeps us constantly running in circles, trying to chase a happy experience, which seems to somehow always be just beyond our reach. And when we get pleasant experiences, they're never quite as good as we like. So this is constantly chasing unsatisfying experiences. And it's because of these three fundamental delusions. So then in the practice of insight meditation, one is cultivating the opposite of these three delusional perceptions. So one is cultivating the three wise perceptions. The wise perception that all experiences are inherently unsatisfying. All phenomena, all things are unstable, impermanent, insubstantial. And nothing whatsoever is our true self. Nothing whatsoever is our true nature. Nothing whatsoever is me or mine. So these are more advanced practices, and I'll talk more about that over the next couple of days. I'll talk more about specifically insight practices over the next couple of days. And insight practices usually are built upon a foundation of samadhi. So one very useful framework that the Buddha laid out in the Yogananda Sutta, so a very famous discourse from the Pali Canon, the Yogananda Sutta. Some of you who are watching may already be familiar with this discourse. So in this discourse, the Buddha talks about three basic strategies. So one strategy is to start by developing tranquility practices and samadhi practices. And then when the mind is peaceful and stable, then one begins to develop insight practices. So that's one strategy. And throughout Buddhist history, this has tended to be the most heavily emphasized strategy because this is actually what works really well for most people. For most people, it's very useful to start with stabilizing and steadying the mind. And then when the mind is relatively stable and steady, then it's easier to do the more advanced and challenging practices of cultivating insight. The second strategy the Buddha gives is to start with practicing insight meditation, to begin with doing these more elaborate, complicated, challenging, investigatory practices. Then when one starts to get more into the practice in that way, then one switches to practicing samadhi. And one practices samadhi for a while until one's mind becomes very stable and still, and then one returns to practicing insight. So that's another strategy the Buddha offers. And the third strategy is what's called Yogananda practice. So Yogananda means joined together, or concurrent, or simultaneous. So this is the simultaneous development of samadhi and wisdom. Simultaneous development of serenity, concentration, and insight. There's a very small number of meditation practices which fit into this third category. And all of them are really difficult. They're not particularly beginner accessible. Again, I'll talk more about this over the next couple of days. The most well-known practice of Yogananda meditation, this simultaneous concentration and wisdom, the most well-known example is called silent illumination, or shikantaza. So this very challenging practice of simultaneous development of concentration and wisdom. So these three basic strategies, they're aimed at different kinds of minds. And I say mind rather than person because we have different minds at different times. So the mind that you have today is not necessarily the same mind that you had yesterday. So maybe yesterday you had the kind of mind that needs to start with Samadhi practice, develop a very stable Samadhi practice before you can practice insight. But then maybe today your mind is at that perfect balance state where you can just plunge right into Yogananda practice, the simultaneous Samadhi and wisdom. And then maybe tomorrow your mind is a bit more scattered and not so clear, or it's really got this strong urge to investigate things and pull things apart, or wants more active practice. So then maybe you start with doing some insight practice tomorrow. And you do some insight practice for a while until you realize that to go farther with your insight practice, you need to stabilize the mind a bit more. So you do the first insight, then Samadhi approach. And you might notice a certain pattern over time. So in my own case, I usually do either first Samadhi, then Vipassana, or I do Yogananda practice of simultaneous Samadhi wisdom. Those are the approaches that normally work the best for me. But I know other people who they usually get better results by starting with doing some kind of wise investigation practice, some kind of meditation practice that's built on examining our experience in terms of the three wise perceptions that I mentioned earlier. And that's the strategy that usually works for them. So coming then to specific practices and specific periods of meditation. So usually the standard advice is if you're not really sure what to do or how to approach your meditation practice, then the standard advice is usually pick a Samadhi method, a tranquility or concentration method, and do just that method for the whole period of meditation. So if you're doing 30 minutes of meditation, then pick a Samadhi method. So perhaps mindfulness of the body, or mindfulness of breathing, or loving kindness meditation. So these three are probably the three most popular forms of Samadhi practice throughout Buddhist history. To pick one of these and do only that for the whole 30 minutes. So this is quite valuable in that it keeps the mind on track. However, as you start to get more familiarity with different meditation methods and different techniques, then you'll start to become familiar with the conditions of mind and what meditation practices are useful under different mental conditions. So as you get that better familiarity, then at the start of a meditation period, you can examine your mind and determine what method is likely to be most helpful and use that method. So rather than just picking something beforehand, instead examine your mind and see what's going to be most helpful and choose a technique that's relevant to your current mental condition. But again, keeping the same method for the whole period of time. Then, once again, as your practice gets more advanced and you get more familiarity, then you can form a more complex strategy. So, for example, for many years, a standard strategy that I would use often was something like, for the first 5 or 10 minutes, I'll practice loving kindness meditation. Then for the next 20 or 30 minutes, I'll practice mindfulness of the body for developing Samadhi. Then for the last 20 minutes or so, I'll practice the perception of impermanence, which is an insight practice. So this is a multi-technique strategy over the course of a single period of meditation. And again, at this point, you want to stick to your strategy. until you have a strong familiarity with mind. Don't deviate from your strategy, because deviating from your strategy is normally just giving into your defilements. It's because you want to do something different. You like this or you dislike that. So we start chasing our likes and dislikes, which means that instead of practicing kusala bhavana, instead of practicing the development of wholesome mind states, instead we're practicing akusala bhavana, the cultivation of unwholesome mind states. So cultivating preference, desire, and aversion. So formulate your strategy and follow it. Again, in the example I just gave, starting with a few minutes of loving kindness meditation, then spending most of the meditation period practicing samadhi, and then the last few minutes practicing insight meditation. So this is a kind of a standard strategy that I used with a great deal of success for many years. Then once you have a certain advanced level of self-familiarity and knowledge of different meditation techniques, then you can use a more free-form approach. And this has to be done carefully, because once again, it can just lead to distraction and agitation if you don't know exactly what you're doing. But with the more free-form approach is that you're constantly adjusting how you're practicing moment by moment, depending upon the conditions of your mind. So, for example, you might start off by doing mindfulness of the body for a few minutes, and then at some point you realize that actually it's not working particularly well. So you might switch to doing mindfulness of breathing for a while. And at some point you might decide that it's time for you to do something else. So you might switch to doing maybe the 6 elements, something totally different. Maybe your mind is very scattered and you want something more active and complicated. So you pick up a practice like the 6 elements contemplation. And maybe you do that for a while and switch to something else. So this style of practice, with switching meditation techniques multiple times during one period, based upon your own intuition, this is not a good idea for most people. For most people, this will not get good results. Under most conditions, this will just generate further agitation and confusion. It will not lead to a strong, stable mind, and it will not lead to deep insight for most people. So this is not particularly recommended unless you, once again, are relatively advanced and know your own mind very thoroughly, and really understand what's going to be of benefit, what's going to lead to good results. So generally speaking, you're much better off making your strategy at the start of the period of meditation and sticking to it. So not deviating from your strategy. And you can adjust your strategy based upon the amount of time. So if you're doing a meditation retreat, for example, then you can have a strategy based upon the length of the retreat. For example, if you're doing a week-long meditation retreat, then you might spend the first 2 or 3 days just doing samadhi practice. And then after those first few days, then you might start integrating some contemplation exercises, some insight practices. This is a very common way of approaching a period of intensive meditation retreat. Or you might just practice samadhi the entire time. One thing which I've observed over the time that I've been a monk, and I've been practicing on my own mind and speaking with other people and observing how their practice is going. One thing that I've come to realize is that the vast majority of people have really weak samadhi. The vast majority of people have very scattered, spacey, distracted minds. Which means realistically, they should just be practicing samadhi 99% of the time. And yet, for some reason, a lot of people seem to think that samadhi is not real Buddhism, and real Buddhism means to practice vipassana, is to practice insight, which again I find highly amusing and not particularly in line with the Buddhist teachings. So being realistic with ourselves, if our samadhi is weak, then we should develop samadhi. If our mind is normally very distractible and confused and unconcentrated, then that's what we really need to work on, is developing mindfulness and concentration. But if we do have very strong mindfulness and a very stable, silent mind, and we notice that we tend to just kind of hang out in that peaceful stillness and not do anything else, well, then yeah, we do need to prod ourselves to do some contemplation exercises, to do some insight practice. But I've found that it's not particularly common. Not that many people have strong samadhi to the point where they just lays out in samadhi all the time. The vast majority of people that I've been in contact with have really weak samadhi. So I really encourage developing samadhi, taking the time to cultivate strong samadhi. If you read through the suttas, you'll see that the Buddha talks about samadhi all the time. And he talks about jhana all the time. So jhana just means strong samadhi. He talks about jhana all the time. And he clearly lists jhana as being an important component of the Noble Eightfold Path, an important component of the path to awakening. So one basic approach to practice is to say, if you don't yet have an experience of at least first jhana, then your samadhi is still very weak. And you need to work on your samadhi. So really work on the cultivation of samadhi, making this strong effort to develop a still, stable, and alert mind. So again, just to give a couple practical techniques that you can apply. So mindfulness of the body. Again, trying to cultivate a still, stable mind. So that means not moving the mind through the body, but picking a place in the body and putting the mind there and not moving the mind from that place. So cultivating a sharp, clear awareness of the body that is not moving, a still, stable awareness of the body. And actually, all you have to do is just not move the mind. So samadhi practice is actually incredibly simple in theory. Just don't move your mind. Don't chase anything. Don't chase any thought. Don't chase any sensation. Don't move the body. And don't move the mind. And pay close attention. And the mind will naturally move deeper and deeper into samadhi. And eventually the mind will enter jhana. That's really it. It's not complicated. So some people get into this whole cloud chasing thing of, well, I should be seeing bright lights and it should be like this and it should be like that and maybe I should do this and maybe I should do that. And actually, no, you don't need to do any of that. You don't need to worry about any of those things. All you have to do is just pick a place to put your mind and keep it there. Don't move your body, don't move your mind, and pay attention. Don't move body or mind, pay attention. That's it. So take your seat, both literally and figuratively. Take your seat and don't move from it. Don't do anything with body or mind except pay attention. Holding completely still, both inside and outside. And your samadhi will develop all by itself. So samadhi is stillness. It's unification of mind. It's non-distraction. It's steadiness. And that happens all by itself if you just stop moving it. So Samadhi practice is very straightforward. It's only difficult because we have such strong habits of moving our mind all the time. We have such strong habits of chasing after this thought and that thought, of thinking this and thinking that, of getting wrapped up in this emotion and that emotion, and drifting here and drifting there, and spacing out and dozing off. And that's why our samadhi is weak, is just because of our habits of moving the mind around all the time, or the habit of not paying attention, the habit of dullness. So samadhi is actually a practice of non-doing. It's a practice of inactivity, which in theory should be the easiest thing in the world. And yet, it's difficult because of our habits of activity. So save those habits of activity, save activity for when it's time to cultivate insight practices. So that's where you can actually apply an active moving mind to produce useful results. But in samadhi practice, just let the mind be still. Awake and still. That's all. So I think at this time I can go ahead and take some questions. So there's already a couple of questions on the live stream here. I can also take questions from the in-person audience here at the monastery if there are any questions. So first off, hello to a few more friends who've joined in. Hello, Elaine, Richard, Annie, Bhavani, and Miguel. So Bhavani asks, what is the difference between ignorance and delusion? Well, one way of saying is that there's not really any difference. But another way of saying it is that ignorance is not knowing what needs to be done. Delusion is having a misperception of reality. So ignorance, avidya in Pali, avidya is not knowing the Four Noble Truths. And even if you intellectually know the Four Noble Truths, if you're not enlightened, then you don't fully know them. Only an enlightened being fully knows the Four Noble Truths. The rest of us just have a superficial concept of them. And so then delusion, as I mentioned earlier, are things like the delusion of conditional happiness, the delusion that if I get what I want, then I'll be happy. But actually that comes from not understanding the Four Noble Truths. If we understood the Four Noble Truths, then we would know that getting what we want will never make us happy. Or the delusion of permanence. But once again, if we really understood the Dhamma, then we would know that nothing is permanent. And the delusion of self-identity. But once again, if we really knew the Dhamma, if we weren't ignorant of the Dhamma, then we would know that everything is conditionally arisen. Therefore, it's not who we are. So ignorance and delusion, they have different connotations, but fundamentally they mean the same thing. Then Gita Jnana asks, the Buddha has given us so many meditation subjects. In your opinion, what subject of meditation is most useful for one, when developed, leads to the path and fruit? Well, once again, it's not necessarily that there's one single technique which works perfectly for everyone, because everyone has different habits of mind, different strengths and weaknesses. So there's not really a single method which is perfect for everyone. However, throughout Buddhist history, there have been a couple methods which have tended to be emphasized as being pretty good for most people. Mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of the body, loving kindness meditation, and the perception of impermanence. So these four methods as a package, form a very good package for leading to awakening. And actually, mindfulness of breathing, if you look at the Buddha's instructions, the 16-step instructions, it is mindfulness of the body combined with the perception of impermanence, ultimately. So you can say mindfulness of breathing, if you're following the Buddha's 16-step instructions, is a complete practice that leads to awakening. But that's only if you're doing the whole set. Normally when people talk about mindfulness of breathing, they're just talking about paying attention to their breathing. But just paying attention to your breathing is simply a samadhi practice. It's just mindfulness of the body, which is great, still great. Samadhi is wonderful. But if you want it to lead to enlightenment, then there needs to be the recognition of impermanence, of not self. So let's see if we have any other questions. That's actually the end of the questions.
I have a question, Bhante.
Go ahead.
For those of us serious about wanting to attain the first jhana, can you talk about the pros and cons, or the benefits and drawbacks of open eye meditation versus closed eyes in relation to the jhanas?
So Venerable Dong Dai Min is asking about practicing with eyes open or closed if one is trying to attain jhana. So the usual recommendation is to have your eyes closed. If you're trying to get into very strong samadhi, and especially into jhana, then you want as little distraction as possible. So eyes closed is normally recommended for that. But as with everything else, it's important to watch and see what happens. So I've occasionally found that I get better samadhi with my eyes open. And usually I do get better samadhi with my eyes closed. But we need to watch and see what happens, because it will be different at different times. But if you're trying to get strong samadhi and you're not sure, then eyes closed is recommended. Eyes open, if you're practicing insight meditation, then eyes open is often recommended for reasons that I'll go into tomorrow and the next day. But for straight jhana practice, then eyes closed is usually better. Okay, anything else?
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there like the time that you suggest for both samadhi and insight?
As long as possible. So Brittany is asking if there's amount of time recommended for samadhi and insight. And in the past, I've usually said that if you're going to do a period of sitting meditation, then to sit for at least 30 minutes. Because realistically, you're not going to get particularly strong samadhi in less than that time. Unless you've already been practicing a lot and you've been living a very quiet and mindful life for the last period of time. So I usually say at least half an hour. But even half an hour, it's quite difficult to get strong samadhi. It's too short. 45 minutes to an hour is better. But actually, if you really want to get strong samadhi, I'm going to give you a piece of advice, which you probably don't want to hear. Most people don't take me seriously the first time they hear me say this. Sit for 4 hours straight every day for a few weeks. It will be painful. It will be agonizing. But your samadhi will improve by leaps and bounds. And as a side benefit, you'll also finally understand what pain is. And you will never see pain the same way again. So I talk from experience on this. This is not, I don't give people advice to do things that I don't have some experience with myself. So this comes from a 3-month retreat I was on many years ago, where the monk who was leading it gave this recommendation. And everyone who was there was like, this guy's got to be joking. Like nobody would actually give such torturous advice. But every day he would sit down at 1:30 p.m. and he would not get up until 5:30 p.m. And so after a couple of days, I was like, well, if he can do it, I can do it too. So then slowly the rest of the community started joining in for these 4-hour periods of sitting. And yeah, it is absolutely agonizing. But at some point you stop resisting. And when you stop resisting, it stops hurting. Pain is all in the mind. It has nothing to do with your body. It's all in the mind. Technically, your body is in your mind too, but that's another story. Yeah, and once you stop resisting it and you just relax into the experience, then your samadhi will be really strong. For insight meditation, there's no recommended length of time. Just keep practicing with it. The other thing also is that we're trying to maintain a continuity of practice through all activities. So sometimes people think my meditation practice starts when I sit down and ends when I get up. But if you think in that way, you will never attain enlightenment. And in fact, you probably won't even get jhana. Instead, we should be trying to maintain mindfulness and internal silence all the time, no matter what we're doing. This is one of the reasons why in monasteries we encourage a lot of quiet time. It's because when we talk, then we stir up the mind. When we scroll through Facebook for hours on end, that's definitely not helping us get jhana anytime soon. It's not good for samadhi. So we cultivate a silent mind all the time in all activities. We pay close attention all the time. We develop equanimity, so non-reactivity at all times. Then that's actually all laying the groundwork for samadhi as well as for insight. So then when we practice meditation, it's a lot easier. Okay. And there's another question on Facebook. Adine asks, what place does walking meditation have in the big picture? So walking meditation is incredibly useful. So realistically, most people are not going to be doing long periods of sitting meditation. And actually, that's a practice which is not really good to do all the time. Because you can, in fact, injure your body if you just sit for 16 hours a day. That's actually not good for your body. It is good to do a little bit of movement and activity, just to do so with mindfulness and serenity. So normally what's done during retreats is to switch between sitting meditation and walking meditation. So maybe you sit for 45 minutes or an hour, and then you walk for 20 or 30 minutes, and then you sit, and you walk, and you sit, and you walk. So switching between sitting and walking is a very useful way of maintaining continuity of awareness while helping to ease the body, helping to keep the body limber, and flexible, and strong. So the long periods of sitting meditation, as I mentioned earlier, they're good for specifically for developing samadhi. And it's a practice which I recommend trying and doing it for a few days or a week or two. But I don't necessarily recommend doing this for years and years. So I do know a couple people who did only sitting meditation, no walking, for many, many hours a day for years, and they wound up hurting themselves. They wound up developing health problems. So it's actually not sustainable as a long-term practice. And even the retreat I mentioned earlier, where we were doing these 4-hour periods of sitting in the afternoons every day, well, the other times of day we would switch between sitting and walking. So in the morning we would do sit, walk, sit, walk, sit. And in the evening, sit, walk, sit. And it was just in the afternoon that we were doing these long periods of sitting. So walking meditation is very useful. And actually, often what you'll find is that during walking meditation, it might feel like not much is happening. But if you really make an effort to be mindful and alert, then when you go and sit down, you'll find that your mind is already primed and ready to go. And if you do walking meditation properly, then even while doing walking meditation, you can get into states of samadhi. Again, not quite as strong as with sitting, but you can get surprisingly strong samadhi with walking meditation. So I think tomorrow I'll give instructions on how to do walking in a beneficial way, or maybe this evening. I think this evening I'll give instructions on walking meditation. Then there's a question Jens is asking, when you do a 4-hour sit, is it okay to change positions? For example, move from sitting to standing, or should we try to sit in the same place? I have a hard time sitting in the same position for an extended period. Well, optimally, you're actually trying to cultivate stillness. So definitely not standing. If you're committing to sit for 4 hours, then sit for 4 hours. But the monk who first introduced me to this practice, he said it's okay to move a bit. You don't necessarily need to hold completely still for the whole 4 hours. It's okay to adjust your posture a little bit from time to time. But to do so slowly and gently, and definitely not to stand up, but to remain in the sitting posture. And again, usually after the first 2 hours or so, then you just stop fighting it and you just relax into it. Because you start to realize it's futile. You move your body a little bit and it still hurts. And then you move your body a little more and it still hurts. And you shift this way and it 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 hurts. And finally you're just like, my body hurts. No matter what I do, it hurts. Oh well. And then the mind goes calm. And when you stop resisting it, then it stops hurting. This is the deep irony. When you finally just accept, okay, this is horrible and miserable and awful. I'll just deal with it as it is. I accept it as it is. The moment you get to that point, then it becomes okay. So I do recommend doing this practice, but again, be attentive to the limits of your body. So some people, if they have a history of physical injuries, or if they're on the older side and their body is not in such good condition anymore, then it's not necessarily good to do these long periods of sitting. But it's worth trying. Just be attentive to your body and make sure you're not actually hurting the body. You're not damaging the body. There's a difference between the ordinary achiness of just sitting for a long period of time and the sharp stabbing pain of damaging the body. They're different kinds of pain, different kinds of sensation. And you can learn to distinguish the difference. Okay, we have another question. Annie asks, when starting to practice anapanasati, that's mindfulness of breathing, do we initially concentrate on the physical sensation where the breath touches the nose? So it doesn't actually matter where you put your attention, as long as you keep it there. So if you want to focus at the tip of your nose, that's fine. Yeah, commonly people will focus just at the base of the nostrils. So right at the point where the, I actually don't know the proper term for this part of the body. Septum, is that what this is called? Septum, yeah, some people focus on their septum because you can get a strong sensation there as you breathe in and out. And that's fine, as long as you don't move your attention from that spot. Put your mind there and keep it there. Other people like to focus on their abdomen. That's also fine, as long as you don't move your attention from that spot. Some people put their attention on the chest. You can also get a strong breath sensation in your chest. Again, fine, as long as you don't move your attention from there. Do you see the pattern? Pick a place. Don't move the mind. That's all. Okay? Anything else? No? Okay, so we'll have another talk this evening. So at 7:30, we'll come together again and do some meditation practice, and then I'll talk a bit more about meditation. So if you have further unanswered questions, you'll have more opportunities to ask them. So for now, we'll go ahead and end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.